"Get out! Go to your family!" Kennedy screamed, his face twisted with rage I barely recognized. He grabbed my arm and shoved me toward the front door of our house. I stumbled in my thin cotton nightgown, the fabric barely covering my knees. "Kennedy, please," I begged, reaching for him. "Let me just get my phone, my shoes." "You don't need anything from this house," he snarled. "Everything here belongs to me now. You signed it all away, remember?" Before I could respond, he pushed me through the doorway onto the cold concrete porch. The door slammed behind me with such force that the windows rattled. I heard the deadbolt click into place. The October night air cut through my nightgown like ice. I wrapped my arms around myself, shivering as I stood barefoot on the porch. Our neighborhood was silent and dark. It was past midnight on a Tuesday. I knocked softly on the door. "Kennedy, please, just let me get some clothes." No answer. The porch light suddenly went dark, leaving me in complete blackness. My heart pounded as reality sank in. My husband of 8 years had just thrown me out with nothing. My name is Melissa Crawford, and until that moment, I thought I understood my life. I was 34 years old, married to Kennedy Crawford, a successful real estate developer. We lived in a beautiful home in Maplewood, an upscale suburban neighborhood. 3 months earlier, Kennedy had convinced me to sign papers transferring our house into his name only. He said it was for tax purposes, that his accountant recommended it. I trusted him completely. After all, he was my husband. 2 months ago, he'd asked me to quit my job as a graphic designer. "I make enough for both of us," he'd said, kissing my forehead. "You've been stressed. Take time for yourself." I'd been hesitant, but Kennedy insisted. Without my income, I'd closed my personal bank account and merged everything into our joint account. Another mistake I now understood too late. Last week, Kennedy had come home late every night, smelling of perfume that wasn't mine. When I asked about it, he'd gotten angry, accusing me of being paranoid and controlling. Tonight, I'd finally checked his phone while he was in the shower. The messages I found broke my heart. He'd been seeing someone named Brielle for 6 months. Their texts talked about their future together, about how Kennedy was handling the Melissa problem. When Kennedy emerged from the bathroom and saw me holding his phone, his expression changed from surprise to cold calculation in seconds. He didn't apologize or try to explain. Instead, he grabbed the phone from my hands and told me to pack my things and leave. I'd refused. This was my home, too. We'd bought it together before he convinced me to transfer the deed. I had rights as his wife. That's when he'd grabbed my arm and physically thrown me out. Now I stood shivering on the porch in October darkness, wearing only a thin nightgown, no shoes, no phone, no wallet, nothing. I heard footsteps on the sidewalk and turned quickly, hope rising that maybe Kennedy had come to his senses. But it wasn't Kennedy. An elderly woman approached slowly, using a cane. She wore a thick bathrobe and slippers. Even in the darkness, I recognized Mrs. Helen Blackwood, my 78-year-old neighbor from 3 houses down. "Melissa," she called softly. "Dear, what's happened?" I heard shouting. Tears finally broke through my shock. "He threw me out. I have nothing." Mrs. Blackwood reached my porch, breathing heavily from the walk. "Come with me right now." Mrs. Blackwood's house was warm and filled with the scent of lavender. She led me to her living room and wrapped a thick blanket around my shoulders before disappearing into her kitchen. I sat on her couch, still trembling, trying to process what had just happened. My bare feet were scraped and dirty from the concrete. My arms had red marks where Kennedy had grabbed me. Mrs. Blackwood returned with hot tea and a plate of cookies. She sat beside me, her kind eyes studying my face. "Tell me everything, dear." I explained the whole situation between sips of tea. The property transfer, quitting my job, the joint account, discovering the affair with Brielle, and Kennedy's violent reaction when I confronted him. "That man is a snake," Mrs. Blackwood said quietly when I finished. "I've watched him for years, always thought something was off about him." She stood up slowly. "You'll stay here tonight. Tomorrow we'll handle this properly. But first, let me get you some proper clothes and tend to those scrapes." As she helped me into a spare bedroom, I felt overwhelming gratitude. "Thank you, Mrs. Blackwood. I don't know what I would have done." She patted my hand. "Call me Helen, dear, and don't worry. Kennedy Crawford has no idea what's coming." The next morning, I woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar curtains. For a moment, I forgot where I was. Then the previous night came flooding back. I found Helen in her kitchen, already dressed and making breakfast. She looked different in the morning light, more alert, her eyes sharper than I'd ever noticed before. "Good morning, Melissa. Sit down. We have much to discuss." She placed scrambled eggs and toast in front of me. "First, eat. You need your strength." As I ate, Helen made phone calls. I heard her speaking to someone named Lawrence about immediate legal intervention and spousal abuse documentation. Then she called someone else about financial fraud investigation. When she hung up, she smiled at me. "My nephew Lawrence is a family law attorney. He'll be here in an hour, and I've contacted a private investigator I know." I stared at her in surprise. "Helen, I can't afford lawyers or investigators. Kennedy controls all our money." "Don't worry about cost," she said firmly. "I'm handling it. You see, dear, I wasn't always a retired widow living quietly in Maplewood. I practiced family law for 42 years before I retired. I know exactly how men like Kennedy operate." My mouth dropped open. "You're a lawyer." "Was," she corrected, "but I still have connections." Lawrence Blackwood arrived at exactly 9 o'clock. He was in his mid-40s, wearing an expensive suit and carrying a leather briefcase. He hugged his aunt before turning to me with a professional smile. "Mrs. Crawford, my aunt has briefed me on your situation. I need to ask you some detailed questions." For the next hour, Lawrence took notes while I described everything. The property transfer papers, the joint account, my resignation from work, Kennedy's behavior, the affair, and last night's violence. "Did Kennedy ever physically hurt you before last night?" Lawrence asked. "He grabbed my arm a few times during arguments," I admitted, "but nothing like last night." Lawrence nodded. "The marks on your arms, did you photograph them?" I shook my head. "I don't have my phone." "We'll document them today," he said. "Now, about these property transfer papers. Did you sign them in front of a notary?" I tried to remember. Kennedy said his office assistant notarized them. I signed them at home. Lawrence and Helen exchanged meaningful glances. "That's interesting," Lawrence said. "Very interesting indeed." He pulled out papers from his briefcase. "I'm filing an emergency protective order today. Kennedy won't be able to contact you or come near you." While Lawrence made calls, Helen took me to her spare bathroom. She carefully photographed the bruises on my arms with a digital camera, making sure to capture every mark clearly. "These photos are evidence," she explained. "In cases like yours, documentation is everything. Kennedy thinks he's clever, but he's made critical mistakes." "What mistakes?" I asked. Helen smiled. "Throwing you out violently, for one. Despite what he believes, you still have spousal rights to that house. He can't just evict you, especially not through physical force. That's domestic violence." She set down the camera. "Second, these property transfers Kennedy had you sign. If they weren't properly witnessed or notarized, they may not be legally valid. Lawrence will investigate that." Hope flickered in my chest for the first time since last night. "So I might still have rights to the house." "More than might," Helen said confidently. "You're still legally married. In this state, even if the house is in his name only, you have marital property rights. But we need to move quickly before Kennedy tries anything else." She handed me clothes that actually fit. "These were my daughter's. She's about your size. She lives in California now." That afternoon, a private investigator named Felix Gaines arrived at Helen's house. He was a short man in his 60s with sharp eyes and a friendly manner. "Helen's told me about your situation," he said, sitting across from me in her living room. "I've been investigating cheating spouses for 30 years. Trust me, men like Kennedy follow patterns." He pulled out a tablet and showed me a checklist. "Based on what you've told me, Kennedy has been planning this for at least 6 months. getting you to sign over the house, convincing you to quit your job, isolating you financially. These are classic control tactics. But why? I asked. If he wanted a divorce, why not just ask for one? Felix exchanged looks with Helen. Because in a normal divorce, you'd be entitled to half of everything. By transferring assets out of your name and making you financially dependent, he thought he could force you out with nothing. My stomach turned. So this was all planned. Most likely, Felix confirmed. The affair with Brielle probably started first. Then Kennedy began moving pieces into place. Men like him think they're so clever, but they always make mistakes. He opened a notebook. I need information about Kennedy's business, his accounts, his routine, everything you know. We're going to find every mistake he made. Over the next 3 days, I stayed at Helen's house while Lawrence and Felix worked. Lawrence filed the emergency protective order, which a judge granted immediately. Kennedy was legally barred from contacting me or coming within 100 feet. Felix discovered that Brielle worked as Kennedy's secretary at his real estate office. She was 26 years old, young and ambitious. According to Felix's investigation, Kennedy had been taking her on business trips and buying her expensive gifts for months. All on the company credit card, Felix told us during a meeting at Helen's dining table. That's fraud if he's been claiming personal expenses as business costs. Lawrence added his findings. I've examined the property transfer documents. The notary's signature is forged. Kennedy's assistant confirmed she never notarized any documents for him. That transfer is completely invalid. Relief washed over me. So the house is still partly mine. The house was never not yours, Lawrence corrected. You're married. Even if the transfer had been valid, you'd still have marital rights. But the forgery makes Kennedy's actions criminal fraud. Helen leaned back in her chair with satisfaction. Now we need to decide our strategy. Do we go aggressive or wait for Kennedy to make more mistakes? Both, I said quietly. Everyone looked at me. I want him to pay for everything. Lawrence filed for legal separation on my behalf, citing domestic violence, fraud, and adultery. The papers were served to Kennedy at his office in front of Brielle and several colleagues. According to Felix's source inside the office, Kennedy had turned white when he read them. He'd immediately called a lawyer, shouting about how I had no rights to anything. That's good, Lawrence said when we heard. Angry people make mistakes. Let him think he's in control while we build our case. Meanwhile, I wasn't idle. Helen had given me her old laptop, and I started documenting everything I could remember. Every conversation about the property transfer, every time Kennedy had pressured me to quit my job, every late night he'd come home smelling of perfume. I also remembered something important. Before I'd quit my job, I'd backed up all my design files to a cloud storage account Kennedy didn't know about. Those files had dates and timestamps proving I'd been working on projects right up until Kennedy convinced me to quit. This is good, Lawrence said when I showed him. It proves you had an active career he convinced you to abandon. That impacts spousal support calculations. Helen smiled at me proudly. You're stronger than you know, Melissa. Keep remembering. Every detail matters. A week after the separation papers were served, Kennedy's lawyer contacted Lawrence requesting a meeting. Lawrence advised me to refuse. Let them come to us on our terms, he explained. Kennedy's panicking because the protective order means he can't access the house. Legally, it's a shared marital residence. With you gone and him barred from contacting you, he's stuck. Can he still live there? I asked. Technically, yes, but he's worried. That forged property transfer document is a criminal matter. If we press charges, he could face fraud charges on top of the divorce. Felix had continued investigating Kennedy's finances. What he found was stunning. Kennedy had been siphoning money from his real estate company into personal accounts for over 2 years. He's been preparing for this longer than we thought, Felix explained. But he got sloppy. The company is partially owned by investors. Moving company funds to personal accounts is embezzlement. Helen studied the financial documents Felix had compiled. So Kennedy isn't just a cheating husband, he's a criminal. Multiple crimes, Lawrence confirmed. Forgery, fraud, embezzlement, and domestic violence. We have him trapped. The question is what Melissa wants to do with all this evidence. I thought about Kennedy's face when he'd thrown me out. The cruelty in his voice, the months of manipulation. I want justice. Lawrence arranged a formal meeting for 2 weeks later at his law office. Kennedy and his attorney would present their divorce settlement proposal. We would listen, then respond with our own terms. In the meantime, I focused on rebuilding. Helen helped me get a new phone and bank account. I contacted my former employer, explaining that I was going through a difficult divorce and asking if any positions were available. To my surprise, my old boss, Sophia, called me back within hours. "Melissa, I'm so sorry about what you're going through. Actually, we've been struggling since you left. None of the designers we hired have your eye for detail. Can you start next week?" I almost cried with relief. Yes, absolutely yes. Great, and Melissa, we're giving you a raise. You were undervalued before. Having a job again changed everything. It meant I wasn't financially helpless. It meant I had options. It meant Kennedy's plan to leave me with nothing had completely failed. When I told Helen the news, she hugged me tightly. "You see, you're not a victim, you're a survivor. Kennedy thought he'd broken you, but he only made you stronger." That night, I slept better than I had since before Kennedy threw me out. The day of the meeting arrived. Lawrence had coached me thoroughly on what to expect. Kennedy's lawyer will try to intimidate you. They'll claim you have no rights, that you abandoned the marriage, that you're entitled to nothing. Don't react. Let me handle it. We sat in Lawrence's conference room. Kennedy arrived with his attorney, a sharp-looking woman named Fiona Walsh. Kennedy wouldn't look at me directly. He seemed thinner, more stressed than I'd ever seen him. Fiona opened her briefcase and pulled out documents. "My client is willing to offer a generous settlement. Mrs. Crawford will receive $20,000 and walk away from all claims to the house, the business, and any other assets." I felt Lawrence tense beside me, but he kept his expression neutral. "Is that everything?" "That's more than fair," Fiona said crisply. "Mrs. Crawford signed legal documents transferring the house to my client. She has no grounds for further claims." Lawrence smiled slightly. "I see. And are you aware that the notary signature on those transfer documents is forged?" The room went silent. Kennedy's face drained of color. Fiona glanced at him sharply. "That's a serious accusation," Fiona said carefully. "It's a documented fact," Lawrence replied calmly. "We have a sworn statement from the supposed notary confirming she never witnessed or notarized those documents." Lawrence slid a folder across the table. "We also have evidence of systematic financial fraud, including embezzlement from Mr. Crawford's real estate company. Money that rightfully belongs to company investors has been moved to personal accounts." Fiona opened the folder, her expression growing darker as she read. Kennedy leaned over to look, and I saw panic in his eyes. "Furthermore," Lawrence continued, "we have documentation of Mr. Crawford's affair with an employee, including company credit card statements showing personal expenses fraudulently claimed as business costs. That's tax fraud." He added another folder. "And finally, we have photographs of the bruises Mr. Crawford left on my client's arms when he physically assaulted her and threw her out of their home in the middle of the night wearing only a nightgown." Fiona's professional composure cracked slightly. She looked at Kennedy with barely concealed anger. "You told me this was a simple divorce." Kennedy stammered. "Those documents are fake. She's lying." "Everything is verified and documented," Lawrence said coldly. "The notary statement is sworn and notarized. The financial records are from official bank statements. The assault photographs are time-stamped and witnessed. My client is prepared to file criminal charges for forgery, fraud, embezzlement, and domestic violence." The room fell silent, except for Fiona's pen tapping on her legal pad. Fiona requested a private meeting with Kennedy. Lawrence and I stepped into another office while they talked. Through the door, I could hear raised voices, Kennedy's defensive tone, Fiona's sharp questions. "She's realizing her client lied to her," Lawrence said quietly. No lawyer wants to walk into court and discover their client has been dishonest. It damages their professional reputation. 20 minutes later, we returned to the conference room. Fiona looked exhausted. Kennedy looked defeated. "My client would like to make a revised offer," Fiona said stiffly. Lawrence leaned back. "We're listening." "Mr. Crawford will agree to a 50-50 split of all marital assets, including the house. He'll pay spousal support for 3 years. In exchange, Mrs. Crawford agrees not to press criminal charges." I felt anger rise in my chest, but Lawrence placed a calming hand on my arm. "That's closer to reasonable," he said, "but not quite there. Here are our terms." He pulled out his own documents. "Mrs. Crawford receives the house outright. Mr. Crawford pays spousal support for 5 years, not 3. He also pays Mrs. Crawford's legal fees, all of them." "That's absurd," Kennedy burst out. "That house is worth $400,000. Lawrence looked at him coldly. "Mr. Crawford, you forged documents, committed fraud, and assaulted my client. Would you like us to pursue criminal charges? I'm sure the district attorney would be very interested." Kennedy's face flushed red, but Fiona put a hand on his arm, stopping him from speaking. "What about the embezzlement allegations?" she asked Lawrence carefully. "That depends," Lawrence replied. "If Mr. Crawford returns the embezzled funds to his company and cooperates with a financial audit, we're willing to keep that matter civil rather than criminal. His investors can decide how they want to handle it." Fiona and Kennedy had another whispered conversation. I watched Kennedy's face cycle through anger, fear, and finally resignation. "We need time to consider these terms," Fiona finally said. "You have 48 hours, Lawrence responded. "After that, we file criminal charges and proceed with a contested divorce. In that case, Mrs. Crawford will be seeking not 50% but 70% of all assets, plus punitive damages for fraud and assault." As Kennedy and Fiona left, Kennedy finally looked at me directly. "You've changed," he said, his voice bitter. I met his gaze steadily. "No, Kennedy, I finally stopped letting you convince me I was worthless." After they left, Lawrence turned to me with a proud smile. "That was perfect. You're going to win this, Melissa." For the first time since Kennedy threw me out in my nightgown, I truly believed it. 2 days later, Fiona called Lawrence. Kennedy agreed to our terms. The house would be mine, along with $50,000 from the joint accounts. He'd pay spousal support for 5 years and cover all my legal fees. In exchange, I wouldn't press criminal charges for the forged documents or the assault. However, the embezzlement evidence would be turned over to Kennedy's business partners, and I wouldn't interfere with whatever actions they chose to take. "It's a good settlement," Lawrence confirmed. "You're getting what you deserve, and Kennedy is paying a real price for his actions." The paperwork took 3 weeks to finalize. During that time, I moved back into the house under protection of the legal order. Kennedy had already moved out, presumably to live with Brielle. Walking through the house that first day back felt strange. Kennedy had taken his personal belongings, but left furniture and household items. The place felt empty, like a shell of the home I'd thought we'd built together. Helen came with me, helping me reclaim the space. "This is your fresh start," she said as we opened windows to air out the rooms. "Make it yours again." I started by changing the locks. Then I repainted the bedroom where Kennedy and I had slept. I chose a soft blue instead of the gray he'd preferred. With each small change, the house felt less like Kennedy's and more like mine. My job at the design firm became my anchor during the divorce proceedings. Sophia had been understanding about my need for flexible hours to meet with lawyers. My colleagues, once they learned what I was going through, offered incredible support. One coworker, a woman named Audrey, pulled me aside during lunch. "My ex-husband tried something similar," she confided. "Tried to take everything in our divorce. I fought back, and now I'm doing better than ever. You're going to get through this." These small moments of solidarity reminded me I wasn't alone. Kennedy had isolated me, but I was rebuilding connections. Felix continued monitoring Kennedy's situation. Through his sources, We learned that Kennedy's business partners had indeed pursued the embezzlement evidence. They'd hired forensic accountants who found even more irregularities than Felix had discovered. Kennedy's real estate company was now under investigation. His partners had forced him out, and there was talk of a lawsuit to recover the stolen funds. "His life is falling apart," Felix reported during one of our final meetings. The affair with Brielle ended shortly after the settlement was finalized. Apparently, she wasn't interested in staying with him once she learned about his financial troubles. I felt no satisfaction in Kennedy's downfall, only relief that I'd escaped before he'd destroyed my life completely. The final divorce decree was issued on a cold December morning, exactly 3 months after Kennedy had thrown me out in my nightgown. Lawrence called me with the news. "It's official. You're divorced. The house is legally yours, the first spousal support payment has been processed, and Kennedy has no further claim on you." I thanked Lawrence for everything he'd done, knowing I could never fully repay him or Helen for saving me. That evening, Helen came over for dinner at my house. Our house, really. In the 3 months since she'd found me shivering on my porch, she'd become more than a neighbor. She was a friend, a mentor, a guardian angel. "You saved my life," I told her as we sat in my living room with tea and cookies, just like that first night at her house. Helen shook her head. "No, dear, I just gave you the tools. You saved yourself. You were strong enough to fight back, smart enough to document everything, and brave enough to demand justice." She raised her teacup in a small toast. "To new beginnings." "To new beginnings," I echoed, clinking my cup against hers. As Helen left that night, I stood at my doorway watching her walk carefully down the sidewalk to her own home. The same sidewalk where she'd found me broken and desperate just 3 months ago. Over the next few months, I transformed the house completely. I bought new furniture, hung my own artwork on the walls, and created a home office for my design work. The space became mine in every sense. My career flourished. Sophia promoted me to senior designer with a substantial raise. I took on exciting projects, including designing the logo and branding for a new local business cooperative. I also started volunteering at a women's shelter on weekends, helping women who'd escaped abusive relationships. My experience with Kennedy, while painful, gave me insight into the manipulation and control these women had endured. "You understand what we've been through," one woman told me during a group session. "You don't just sympathize, you know." Through the shelter, I met other survivors who'd rebuilt their lives after devastating betrayals. Their strength inspired me. We formed a support network, meeting monthly to share our progress and challenges. Kennedy's spousal support payments arrived on time each month, directly deposited into my account. I saved most of it, investing in my future security. Never again would I be financially dependent on anyone. Felix had one final update about Kennedy. The lawsuit from his business partners had been settled. Kennedy had to repay $200,000 in embezzled funds, essentially bankrupting him. He'd taken a job with another real estate firm in a junior position. 6 months after the divorce, I decided to host a small dinner party at my house. I invited Helen, Lawrence, Felix, Sophia, and Audrey from work. These were the people who'd helped me rebuild my life. As we gathered around my dining table, eating the meal I'd cooked in my kitchen, laughing and sharing stories, I felt genuine happiness for the first time in years. "To Melissa," Helen said, raising her wine glass, "who turned a nightmare into a new beginning." Everyone joined the toast, and I felt tears prick my eyes, but they were good tears this time. After dinner, as Helen and I cleaned up in the kitchen, she said quietly, "I'm proud of you, dear. You could have let what Kennedy did break you. Instead, you let it make you stronger." "I had help," I reminded her, "if you hadn't found me that night." "I found you because I've always been a light sleeper," Helen interrupted with a smile. "And because I've lived in this neighborhood long enough to recognize the sound of trouble. But what you did with the chance you were given, that was all you." She dried her hands on a kitchen towel. "You know, in my 42 years of practicing family law, I saw so many women give up their power because they were told they had none. You refuse to accept that story. 1 year after Kennedy threw me out, I sat on my front porch on a warm October evening, wrapped in a cozy blanket, watching the sunset. The same porch where I'd stood shivering in a nightgown, believing my life was over. My phone buzzed with a text from Helen checking if I wanted to join her for her morning walk tomorrow. I smiled and replied yes. I'd learned so much in that year. I learned that strength isn't about never falling down, it's about getting back up. I learned that asking for help isn't weakness, it's wisdom. I learned that sometimes the worst things that happen to us can lead to the best versions of ourselves. I'd also learned that justice doesn't always look like revenge. My justice was this house, my career, my independence, and my peace of mind. Kennedy's punishment was living with the consequences of his own choices. Through neighborhood gossip, I'd heard Kennedy was dating again, though his relationships never lasted long. He'd moved to a small apartment across town and drove an old car instead of the luxury sedan he used to own. His reputation in the real estate community was damaged beyond repair. But I didn't think about Kennedy much anymore. He was a chapter in my past, not a presence in my present. My second year of freedom brought unexpected joy. I met someone new, a contractor named Wesley who came to fix my porch railing. He was kind, respectful, and most importantly, patient with my caution about relationships. "I'm not in a hurry," Wesley told me on our third date. "I know you've been through a lot. We can take this as slow as you need." That consideration meant everything to me. We dated slowly and carefully. Wesley met Helen, who approved of him immediately. "He looks at you with respect," she observed. "That's how you know he's different from Kennedy." My work continued to thrive. I'd been promoted again and now led a team of 3 junior designers. Teaching them, mentoring them, and watching them grow reminded me how far I'd come. The women's shelter asked me to join their board of directors. I accepted, knowing my experience and perspective could help shape programs for other survivors. Life wasn't perfect. I still had moments of anger about what Kennedy had done, days when I struggled with trust. But those moments became less frequent and less intense as time passed. Helen celebrated her 80th birthday with a party I organized at my house. As I looked around at the gathered friends and neighbors, I marveled at how different my life was from 2 years ago. 3 years after the divorce, I received a letter from Kennedy's lawyer. The spousal support would end in 2 years as agreed, but Kennedy was requesting early termination due to financial hardship. I brought the letter to Lawrence, who'd remained my attorney for various legal matters. He read it and laughed. "Kennedy's trying to get out of his obligations early. Not surprising." "What should I do?" I asked. Lawrence leaned back in his chair. "Legally, he owes you 2 more years of support. You're entitled to that money, but the question is whether you want to fight him for it." I thought about it carefully. The spousal support had been helpful initially, but I no longer needed it. My salary was substantial, my savings healthy, and my investments growing. "Tell him I'll agree to terminate early on one condition," I said. "He pays me a lump sum of half the remaining payments and signs a document releasing all claims to any part of my life permanently." Lawrence smiled. "Perfect, that's fair but firm." Kennedy agreed within a week. The lump sum payment arrived shortly after, along with the signed release. I deposited the check, then deleted Kennedy's contact information from my phone. That chapter was finally completely closed. 5 years after standing on that porch in my nightgown, I hosted Thanksgiving dinner at my house. Wesley was there, now my fiancé. Helen sat at the head of the table as our honored guest. Sophia and Audrey from work attended, along with several friends from the Women's Shelter Board. As we went around the table sharing what we were grateful for, I felt almost overwhelmed by how much had changed. "I'm grateful for second chances," I said when my turn came, "and for the people who believed I deserved one." Helen squeezed my hand. "And we're grateful you had the courage to accept help and fight for yourself." After dinner, as Wesley helped me clear dishes, he paused and pulled a small box from his pocket. "I know we said we'd wait until Christmas for this, but I can't wait anymore." He got down on one knee right there in my kitchen, surrounded by dirty plates and leftover turkey. "Melissa, will you marry me?" I said yes through tears of joy. As he slipped the ring on my finger, I looked through the kitchen window at the house across the street where I'd once lived with Kennedy, where I'd thought my life would unfold so differently. That house had new owners now, a young couple with a baby. They waved when they saw me, friendly neighbors I'd helped welcome to the street. My life hadn't turned out how I'd planned. It had turned out better. Kennedy had meant to destroy me when he threw me out that October night. Instead, he'd freed me to become someone stronger, someone who knew her worth, someone who would never again let anyone diminish her. And it had all started with an elderly neighbor who heard shouting in the night and chose to help. Helen had saved me, but more importantly, she taught me to save myself. As I stood in my kitchen wearing my new engagement ring, surrounded by people who loved and respected me, living in the home that was truly mine, I understood something fundamental. Kennedy had taken nothing from me that night. He'd given me everything I never knew I needed: the push to fight back, the reason to rebuild, and the opportunity to discover just how strong I really was. The nightmare had become my greatest gift, and that was the best revenge of all.